and to a certain extent that step had succeeded. He had not altogether built his hopes upon sand, for from what Ida had said, and still more from what she had tacitly admitted, it was necessarily clear to him that she did more or less regard him as a man would wish to be regarded by a woman whom he dearly loved. This was a great deal, more indeed than he had dared to believe. But then, as is usually the case in this imperfect world, where things but too often seemed to be carefully arranged at sixes and sevens, came the other side of the shield. Of what use to him was it to have won this sweet woman's love? Of what use to have this pure water of lawful happiness put to his lips in the desert land of his lonely life, in order to see the cup that held it shattered at a blow? To him the story of the money loan, in consideration of which, as it were, Ida had put herself in pawn, as the Egyptians used to put the mummies of their fathers in pawn, was almost incredible. To a person of his simple and honourable nature it seemed a preposterous and unheard of thing that any man calling himself a gentleman should find it possible to sink so low as to take such advantage of a woman's dire necessity and honourable desire to save her father from misery and her race from ruin, and to extract from her a promise of marriage in consideration of the value received. Putting aside his overwhelming personal interest in the matter, it made his blood boil to think that such a thing could be. And yet it was, and what was more, he believed he knew Ida well enough to be convinced that she would not shirk the bargain. If Edward Cossey came forward to claim his bond, it would be paid down to the last farthing. It was a question of £30,000. The happiness of his life and of Ida's depended upon a sum of money. If the money was forthcoming, Cossey could not claim his flesh and blood. But where was it to come from? He himself was worth perhaps £10,000, or with the commutation value of his pension, possibly 12, and he had not the means of raising a farthing more. He thought the position over till he was tired of thinking, and then with a heavy heart, and yet with a strange glow of happiness shining through his grief like sunlight through a grey day, at last he went to sleep and dreamed that Ida had gone from him, and that he was once more utterly alone in the world. But if he had cause for trouble, how much more was it so with Ida? Poor woman, under her somewhat cold and stately exterior she had a deep and at times a passionate nature. For some weeks she had been growing strangely attached to Harold Quaritch, and now she knew that she loved him, so that there was no one thing that she desired more in this wide world than to become his wife. And yet she was bound by a sense of honour, and a sense too of money received, to stay at the beck and call of a man she detested. And if at any time it pleased him to throw down the handkerchief, to be there to pick it up and hold it to her heart. It was bad enough to have had this hanging over her head when she was herself more or less in a passive condition, and therefore to a certain extent reckless as to her future. But now that her heart was alight with the holy flame of a good woman's love, now that her whole nature rebelled and cried out aloud against the sacrilege involved, it was both revolting and terrible. And yet, so far as she could see, there was no great probability of escape. She was a shrewd and observant woman, and could gauge Mr. Cossey's condition of mind towards her with more or less accuracy. Also, she did not think it in the least likely that, having spent £30,000 to advance his object, he would be content to let his advantage drop. Such a course would be repellent to his trading instincts. She knew in her heart that the hour was not far off when he would claim his own, and that unless some accident occurred to prevent it, it was practically certain that she would be called upon to fulfil her pledge, and whilst loving another man, to become the wife of Edward Cossey. End of chapter 19.